Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and welcome back to Avengers versus X-Men versus the Eternals, where all three of these groups basically fight each other at some point over the course of the story. Now, if you guys want to get caught up, we'll have a little notification that'll pop up here in a second that'll take you to the playlist where you can get caught up on everything. But what this does here is this picks up with the Eternals, who have launched their attack against the X-Men. Now, we covered that in the last video, right? We covered the Eternals making their attack against the mutant nation of Krakoa. What the Eternals did not account for was the fact that Krakoa has some ridiculously powerful mutants here. Some of the most powerful beings that exist in the universe exist on this island, and one of them is Exodus, which of course we covered, and Exodus quite literally takes on one of these Eternals by himself. And it's kind of a crazy thing, because when that happens, he takes this guy out with a quickness. I mean, it happens so fast. Exodus just destroys these guys, and that's to be expected, because remember, Exodus is one of the most powerful beings to ever exist in the history of Marvel Comics. The guy's ridiculously OP. But the other part of this is that you do have Eternals, all of whom have varying powers. We don't really get the specifics of this Eternal's power, the one that Exodus destroys, but there is one that's attacking the other part of the island that in fact Cyclops and those guys are dealing with, and that one has the ability to manipulate the fauna, manipulate basically the plant life and plant matter around the island, so much so that it actually starts using the island itself against the X-Men. Now, they are able to hold their own to a degree, but in the midst of all this, the X-Men are met by the arrival of the Avengers. Now, I know you guys are probably asking yourself, but if this is Avengers versus X-Men versus Eternals, shouldn't the Avengers be fighting the X-Men? We'll talk about that here in a minute. But when the Avengers arrive on the scene, one of the things to know is that their arrival here is one part due to the fact that there's a massive calamity taking place, but the other part of this is because of the history between the Avengers and the X-Men. So for those of you guys who are familiar with this, bear with me here for a second. For those of you guys who don't know what this means, in Marvel Comics, there was a story that was called Avengers versus X-Men, and it was amazing because not only did you get to see the teams fight each other, Marvel actually released a series of one-shots that focused on the Avengers facing off against different members of the X-Men. So Captain America versus Gambit, different things like that. It was a really cool series. We might go back and remaster when they announced the X-Men in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But the thing about this is that the Avengers being here is because of the fact that they didn't initially want to fight the X-Men in the Avengers versus X-Men story. Things just transpired that way. And so because of that, there's a kind of a mixed reaction here. Exodus does not want them here, and Exodus is a member of the governing body of the X-Men, so his word goes a pretty long way. But in the end, while he is a member of the governing body of protecting Krakoa, it's not really left to Exodus and the Quiet Council to decide. It's left to the war chiefs, and at the end of the day, they're just like, the Avengers can join. Now, one of the things to keep in mind here is that while this battle is going on Krakoa, that you do have a subsect of the Eternals that had actually abandoned Druig, who's currently leading the Eternals themselves, and he's the one that's waging war against the X-Men and presumably the Avengers, or at least we'll see in the future of this story. And so because of that, you do have some of these Eternals who are actually working with Iron Man. They're working with Riri Williams, also known as Ironheart. They're working with them to actually revitalize Avengers Mountain. Now, here's one of the things to understand. Avengers Mountain is actually a giant celestial, and it has been since that story was introduced, since it was launched by Jason Aaron. It's known as the Progenitor Celestial. This is arguably the most powerful of all the Celestials, but the significance of the Progenitor is that it was here, or at least arrived on Earth, due to an attack it was already sustaining, and because it was basically dying from the inside out when it was being killed by the Horde, who were basically kind of like the arch nemesis of the Celestials. But what ended up happening is that when it arrived on Earth, quite literally, its blood seeded life on the world, and that's how Marvel offers a modern day explanation of where life came from on Earth, that it's a result of the Progenitor Celestial. But the goal here of the Eternals and Iron Man and Riri Williams is to basically resurrect the Progenitor. Now, the thing about this, and what's really kind of a funny kicker here, is that you basically switch back to the Avengers and the X-Men facing off against each other. And one of the things to know is that the X-Men, ever since the launch of Krakoa, have had the ability to resurrect themselves. It's why it doesn't matter whenever an X-Man dies, depending on the situation, because the Quiet Council could decide not to bring them back, and there's no way for that X-Man or that mutant to return. But by and large, most almost all of them do. So even when you had it was actually the great uncle of Thanos, but even when you had the great uncle of Thanos who showed up on Mars, where you have basically another subsect of mutants residing and killed 15 million of them, at the end of the day, they can just resurrect them all. It's gonna take a while because there's 15 million of them, but they can still resurrect them. At that point, it just comes down to whether or not the mutants on Krakoa want to. But the thing behind this is that Captain America literally tells Cyclops, hey, we're definitely here to help, man, but I wish you told us before, with everything that we've gone through, I wish you told us before that you had the ability to basically resurrect yourselves. And that's when Cyclops, like, think about what you just said, man. After everything we've been through, you guys waged war on us. Why would we tell you that we have the ability to resurrect ourselves? And that's one of those instances when Captain America is kind of like, okay, yeah, you kind of have a point. But basically, the X-Men and the Avengers team up to face off against the Eternals. Now, the cool thing about this is that, again, the Eternals launching their attack is happening in multiple stages. They're attacking the mutant nation of Krakoa. That's where these gigantic Eternals called the Hex, that's where they're focusing most of their attack. But one of the things to remember is that Namor the Submariner is a mutant. And as a result of that, one of the Eternals, one of the members of the Hex, has gone to Atlantis. Now, that member of the Hex has basically been dealt with by a combination of the X-Men and Namor the Submariner, who are basically able to destroy it. The problem with this is that with this destruction basically comes essentially an explosion underwater. And as you can imagine, if something that massive, right, is basically as big as Galactus or a Celestial, if it were to just explode in the ocean, it's going to create tidal waves, it's going to create tsunamis, earthquakes, all different kinds of things. And what this does is it leads to what's literally a worldwide calamity of essentially these just coastal cities being overrun. And so what ends up going on is the X-Men tell the Avengers, get out of here, go deal with that threat, we'll continue dealing with this here. So where the Avengers leave, the initial kind of offering by Exodus is, I told you guys, the Avengers were going to abandon us. And where Nightcrawler chimes in and says, no, the Avengers are on our side, that's not a fair assessment, Destiny chimes in. Now remember, Destiny is a mutant that can see the future. The further she looks into the future, the less clear her predictions come. And so because of that, because everything going on here is such a huge event, and because Destiny is able to see pretty accurately into the near future, she corrects Nightcrawler and says, no, that is the case. The Avengers really are abandoning us here. This is going to turn into a war where we are going to be fighting both the Avengers and the Eternals. We're going to be waging a war on two fronts. So it's one of those things to kind of correct that concern that you guys had of, okay, is this really going to work? No. This is exactly how the event's going to play out. It is really going to be the Avengers versus the X-Men versus the Eternals. Now, well, again, while that huge fight's taking place at Krakoa, we basically jump back to Iron Man, to Mr. Sinister, to the Eternals themselves, at least the ones who are not waging war against the X-Men. And you basically have them traveling around the world to different locations and basically grabbing little pieces of what are Celestials that have existed on Earth at some previous point in time or visited in some capacity. There was a point in the past where the thumb of Arishem the Judge had basically been left on Earth. I know it seems kind of weird, but that's effectively taken. There was a point where a piece of the Dreaming Celestial, who you guys probably recognize as Tiamu from the Eternals film, that Dreaming Celestial had been buried on Earth at one point in time, but there is a kind of life essence of the Dreaming Celestial that still resides here on Earth. At the same time, you also have the Destroyer armor of Asgard, which was created by Odin when they were initially dealing with the third host, the potential threat of the Celestials, and Odin and the Asgardians and even Zeus and the Olympians were all going to go to war with the Celestials. They ultimately never did. The Destroyer armor was annihilated, and that's when the Skyfathers realized, okay, we're kind of out of our league here. We're just going to leave these guys alone and let them do their thing. But one of the other big moments to know is that when it comes to the history of the Celestials on Earth, that they had not just been involved with the creation of the Eternals and the X-Men, or at least mutants as they would come to exist in Marvel Comics, but they also created the Deviants. But the Deviants were the ones who initially waged war on the Celestials. And so the Celestials had essentially annihilated most all of the Deviants and pushed them to the brink of extinction. The reason why this matters is because ever since that point in time, the Deviants view the Celestials with reverence. They view them as absolute gods. And so the significance of that is there is no group on Earth that knows more about the Celestials than the Deviants themselves. Even though the Eternals were created by the Celestials, even their knowledge is not that intense. Their knowledge is not as in-depth as the Deviants are. And so the more significant part of this is actually Tony Stark himself. And this is genius because in the Christopher Cantwell Iron Man comics, and partially even in the comics of the Incredible Hulk by Donny Cates, there came a point where Tony Stark had actually piloted a dead Celestial. Now, Tony Stark's done that several times. In fact, there was one point where he piloted the God Killer armor, which was amazing. And if you're curious about that, we do have a video on that. You'll see that card pop up here in a second. You're welcome to check that out when this video is finished, but it was just a ridiculously amazing story. But because Tony Stark has experience with basically using the bodies of Celestials, and because his body remembers what it means to be a part of a Celestial, his nervous system is basically being copied and is going to be the blueprint. And so what this basically means is that by them going around and collecting all these different parts, and you've probably figured this out, they're going to use this to rebuild the progenitor Celestial. They're remaking a Celestial. Now, the thing that happens here is we switch back over to the X-Men themselves, right? We switch back over to the mutant nation of Krakoa, and again, you have this massive fight that takes place. Now, where Exodus had already destroyed one of the Hex Eternals, what this does is it leads him to facing off against another Eternal known as Syne. Now, one of the things to remember is that Exodus is a telepath and telekinetic of the highest order. This guy's power is rivaled by very precious few people. And depending on what era we're talking about in Marvel Comics, not even Jean Grey, who was at one point a host for the Phoenix Force, not even Jean Grey's power is on par with this guy. But the full brunt of Exodus' power comes to bear when he faces off against Syne. And in doing so, Syne actually sends out this kind of telepathic message to Exodus, which he ignores or potentially doesn't even notice because of the moment, where Syne simply says, "Please don't." But Exodus basically detonates himself, and in doing so, unleashes all of his telekinetic energy at one time and destroys Syne the Eternal. Now, the thing about this, and this is what's so funny here, is initially the X-Men celebrate this as a moment of reprieve. They celebrate it as, okay, we destroyed that Eternal. Basically, everything is okay. Let's just kind of keep on keeping on, which, by the way, I may have referred to some of the Eternals as Celestials. My bad. The giant robot things you see, those are basically Eternals here. The only Celestial that's part of this is the Celestial that's being recreated or being rebuilt by Tony Stark and all those guys. But the thing behind this is, and one of the things to remember, and this was established during Kieran Gillen's run, the dark reality of the Eternals, which they didn't know about, is that every single time one of them dies, they're resurrected, which they did know about. What they didn't know is a random human life is taken to basically resurrect that Eternal. There's no rhyme or reason behind why it happens. So while the X-Men do have the ability to resurrect their own, and they prioritize those who were either the most powerful or those who were basically fighting on the fronts at the moment, the Eternals resurrect themselves as well. The difference here is that when Exodus is resurrected, there is a kind of limit. When the X-Men resurrect themselves, their minds are basically backed up. And so when Exodus was resurrected, it's the most recent backup for his character, essentially meaning it was before this war broke out. So while he is telepathically reminded of everything that went on, for him, it's information. When Syne, the Eternal, is resurrected, she remembers not only the events and everything that transpired, but how she felt. And when she had begged for her life for Exodus not to kill her, and he did it anyway, now it involves hate. And the war is right back on again. That literally Syne immediately goes back on the attack, like shows right back up again, goes right back on the attack. And when that happens, Syne had remembered everything and learned. And that's the difference, that the X-Men are able to learn to a degree, but they're when they're resurrected, their memories have to basically be provided to them by way of secondhand information. And that's what's going on here with the Eternals, that the Eternals being resurrected, they're resurrected exactly as they were before. Like the moment they died, they remember everything, including their emotional state, and they remembered everything they saw, all the weaknesses and all the strengths of the conflict. And that's why Syne looks at everything going on and says, okay, the only way to really basically stop these X-Men is to destroy the island on which they live. And so Syne immediately starts attacking the island. Now, it's one of these moments where literally they're just like, we can't stop her. Like, Syne's resurrected here. Like, we just have people coming back. We're still in the process of resurrecting. Like, Exodus could potentially destroy Syne again, but the reality here is if he tried that, Syne would actually stop him, because Syne would know that's exactly what he was going to do. Syne learned from the past experiences. And so literally all hope is lost here. The mutant nation of Krakoa is about to be obliterated. Even Nightcrawler, right? A man of God is just like, please deliver us from this. And that right then is when the Celestial comes online, and the Celestial immediately sticks his hand out and says, cease. And like everybody stops. The war just stops. just like that. Like the Eternals back off. Everything just ends. And it's one of those crazy moments because it's just kind of like, okay, you know, like you literally have Iron Man and you've got Riri Williams and you've got the Eternals who have sided with the X-Men and the Avengers and who are like, okay, cool, everything's copacetic. We brought back this Celestial. It's under our control. Nope, wrong. This is the most powerful Celestial ever because it's an amalgamation of all the other Celestials merged into one using the bits and pieces of technology that could be found. It's Frankenstein. It's a Frankenstein Celestial, but it's still the most powerful Celestial. And unlike what they had previously believed to have been the case, which was they could control it, the reality is they can't because it exists, therefore it judges. And it literally says, people of Earth, listen, you are bickering children. The planet is ruined. You have acted with unrelenting unkindness to one another. You leave me no option. This is your judgment day. You have 24 hours to justify your existence. You will be judged individually. You will be judged as a collective. If there's more good than evil among you, you will live. But if you are found lacking, there will be no tomorrow. I will annihilate every single one of you. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.